November 16th, 2015. This is the day that NRG Zam would submit the very first speedrun to the most popular category in all of Bloons TD5, that being the iconic track Monkey Lane on easy difficulty. And since then, players have optimized this record by quite a large amount, and by mid-2018, it was getting painfully close to the sub 5 minute barrier. Now, you would think that with how dominant players like Valmyrix and especially Light SDS were at this time, that one of these two would have surely taken the record back from Does This username, and eventually pushed each other to breaking through that barrier. But what would happen instead is for nearly 7 years straight, Does This username would hold the Monkey Lane easy difficulty world record. And in the meantime, many other players would submit their own times as well, with some names you might recognize in there, such as Wii Super, who is well known for LEGO Star Wars. But none of these players could dethrone the top 3. Not until I decided to host a tournament just a few months ago as a way to give back to my community. And wouldn't you know it, a player named Barbados would go on to smash the world record twice, and with the second one, the sub 5 minute barrier as well. However, Barbados himself literally called the method that he used to get this record cringe, and at least one other top player agrees as well. So how did we get to this point? And why did it take so long for us to see a new world record in the first place? Well, let's take a closer look at the first run ever submitted. With a time of 7 minutes and 40 seconds, it sits at 90th place today, but honestly, for being the first to ever do it, NRG Zam definitely could have done worse, especially considering that the version of the game that they're playing, which is the original Flash version of BTD5, is actually slower than playing on mobile or Steam overall. But that's not to say that this run didn't have any mistakes either. By far the biggest one is simply the placement of their towers. As you can see, it takes a moment for the Bloons to reach them, so at the end of each round, NRG Zam was losing a little bit of time. There were also times where their defense simply wasn't optimal to catch everything, despite being in a pretty good spot on the track, and I really think that's a consequence of using the Wizard Monkey here. Beyond that, they also got the distraction upgrade on their Ninja, which led to moments like this. As you can see, a single blue balloon got sent backwards and greatly extended how long that round took to complete. But again, this is literally the very first run ever submitted, and overall, it would stand as the record for the remainder of 2015, not being beaten until January 10th of the next year by a player named Love Unicorn. And they managed to drop the record by 23 seconds, but unfortunately, their video is now privated. But weirdly enough, another player named ZYXO Quack would literally beat the record by 1 second on the exact same day? I don't really know what the odds of that are, but I will say by far the biggest improvement with this run compared to the 740 is simply the placement of Quack's towers, with them being a good bit closer to the entrance. Although I couldn't believe my eyes when they actually pulled out a portable lake in order to make it possible to get down a Buccaneer Monkey, as it needs to be placed in water, which Monkey Lane doesn't have anywhere. I guess back then there wasn't any rule against this, but today, the only special agent you can use is a single banana farmer, which isn't allowed to be anywhere near the track. But regardless, this record would stand quite a lot longer than the one it replaced, for just over 5 months in fact, before being beaten by not so super SMB, who managed to improve the time by a full 26 seconds. And wouldn't you guess it, the video for this has now been privated as well. But this record really only got to stand for about a week and a half, as on June 22nd of 2016, a player by the name of Atomical Sloths would make the single biggest improvement that this record had ever seen up to that point, and will ever get to see again. And that's because they managed to drop the record by exactly 1 full minute, bringing the time down to a 5:50 now. And you might also notice, this is the first record to actually be set on the mobile version of BTD5 as opposed to the Flash version. Now honestly, I can't say why it took so long for players to actually start using this version, as BTD5 was initially released for Apple devices back in late 2012. But maybe everyone who competed before Atomical Sloths simply preferred playing on Flash. And you might also notice that the strategy used here is definitely better as well, with him mainly focusing on getting up cheaper defense such as Moab Maulers, Bloon Jitsus, and also using that triple dart in the beginning to ultimately get the time down very significantly from before and really start to bring the speedrun forward as a whole. And it's also fair to say that any run completed with the same strategy on the Flash version of the game will always be slower than that same run being played on the mobile or Steam version of BTD5. But it's also really a shame that both of the next two records set can no longer be viewed today. this is becoming quite a common issue, and Borum specifically pushed the time all the way down to a 5:23, so I'm certain that their strategy was a bit more optimized. Thankfully though, we still can view Murmanox's 5:21, which they set as the new world record on February 24th of 2017. And just like Atomical Sloth's run, this one also uses a lot of towers that are really good for speedrunning. Murmamax also started with a triple dart monkey, and they also got a second one before getting up their ninja monkey as well, but they did make the more questionable choice of also getting a juggernaut, which I guess isn't terrible necessarily. However, when it comes to speedrunning, it's just not going to be the fastest thing, because keep in mind, that's a tower that's specifically designed to deal with ceramic balloons, which we've already seen there's better ways to do. However, what they did do next was very interesting to me, as they chose to get up a super monkey and then get the laser vision without ever buying plasma. And if you've seen my video where I tested a full map of every tier 2 tower, you'll probably remember that the plasma vision actually makes the super monkey worse in this specific version of BTD5 due to the fact that laser vision counts as 2 projectiles while plasma counts as 1. So I'm not sure if this was common knowledge back in 2017, but Murmamax never actually upgraded their super monkey to plasma at all, instead getting it as a 1-3 robo monkey, which allowed them to then set their world record. And this record would end up standing for a decent bit of time, as it wasn't until the very end of the year, December 28th of 2017, that Murmanox's record would finally be beaten. However, the player to do so is quite important in this story. You see, Light SDS would only beat Murmanox's world record by a single second with their first run, although to be fair, they did do so in an interesting way, choosing to rely entirely on triple dart monkeys with a single Bloon Jitsu ninja before eventually getting the Super Monkey fan club, which they didn't even bother using, and I'm assuming that this was basically a flex. And you can see that they also had the dart monkey specialist building maxed out as they're shooting explosive darts. Now, once Light SDS had set their record, it wouldn't take nearly as long to be broken as before. In fact, this is where another player comes in who is also quite integral in the push towards the sub 5-minute barrier, as on January 18th of 2018, Valmerix would take a run that had already begun to get decently optimized and shave another 8 seconds off. 5:12 is definitely a solid speedrun, even by today's standards, but for early 2018, it was on another level. However, rather unfortunately, this run was uploaded on Twitch, and it appears from everything that I can tell at least, that their system ended up deleting it today. But thankfully, Light SDS was actually up to the challenge of meeting Valmerix's new standard, as they managed to achieve a new world record time of 5:09 just 1 week after losing their previous world record. And the optimizations within the towers being chosen were definitely clear, as Light SDS chose to get a ninja monkey and dart monkey, which eventually became 2 Bloon Jitsus and a triple dart, both of which are great for speedrunning easy mode in this game. I did find it interesting that they got a couple Moab Maulers well before the first Moab was actually coming out, but this did fortify their defense a bit and also gave them a cheap preemptive setup that would be ready for round 46. And this also allowed them to afford a Super Monkey as well, which unfortunately, Light SDS did eventually upgrade from a laser vision to a plasma vision, but still, this run overall was quite efficient already, with very little time being wasted between rounds. And I guess one world record wasn't enough, because Light SDS would go on an absolutely insane tear over the next 5 days, setting 5 new records that would culminate in a final time of 5:04.250, which is the first time that we would actually see milliseconds being included. And that's how you know the record is starting to truly get optimized, as Light SDS would finally start putting their towers as close to the beginning of the track as possible. This significantly cuts down wasted time at the end of each round on its own, enough to where that is literally the only difference in their strategy compared to the 5:09. Although it's also very possible that they'd also gotten better at the other most important aspect of this speedrun, which is making sure to start each round as quickly as possible. You see, using round auto start actually adds a ton of extra time to your speedrun, so you have to manually start each round yourself. On the Steam version of the game, this is quite easy, as you can press the spacebar, but the better that your timing is, the faster your run will be, especially at this point where the towers being used and their placements has become quite optimized on its own. Now, insanely enough, just 1 day after Light SDS had their insane tear through the game, Valmerix would respond with a new world record of 5:04 flat, before improving their own time to a 5:03.680 4 days after that. And the optimization that they made here is quite important as well. by using the best tower to start with in all of BTD5 speedrunning, which is a 1-0 engineer with the specialist building enabled. This allows it to pop lead balloons, along with converting its sentries into super sentries that are insanely powerful and quite overpowered compared to the price of a 1-0 engineer. And Valmerix was able to use this to actually afford a banana farm, which I definitely found interesting to see in a run that's below medium difficulty, but they also upgraded their engineer into a cleansing foam, which is quite powerful in its own right, along with a Bloon Jutsu as well. And as they pushed forward getting extra income from the banana farms, Valmerix ended up being able to afford a 4-0 Apache dart ship, which is a very powerful tower against all regular balloons, and I think that definitely served well with the Moab Assassin. And sure enough, this is a world record that Light SDS would never end up contesting. In fact, it stood for 4.5 months before a player by the name of Does This Username would actually improve the record by just 280 milliseconds. And they started off by getting a 1-0 engineer as well, although this was not upgraded before getting a Bloon Jutsu ninja, and there was no farming to be seen either. Then they got a second 1-0 engineer before continuing to build up their ninja monkeys, and finally, Does This Username had the very smart idea to use the 0-4 Monkey Aces Ground 0 ability on the late rounds to clear everything out before any time could be wasted. And this is exactly where we would see the world record stand for the next 6.5 years. You see, just 6 days prior to Does This Username setting their world record of 504.400, Bloons Tower Defense 6 would officially be released. And as you might have guessed, that game has a far bigger speedrunning scene than ours does today. So naturally, it only made sense that with all the history this record had already had to becoming as optimized as it was, nobody was going to take the time to try and compete when BTD6 was becoming far more popular. So then, how did Barbados take nearly 5.5 seconds off this time and smash the 5-minute barrier? Well, it actually started with a tournament that I decided to host for this very speedrun a few months back. And basically, there was a total of $125 in cash prizes, along with an extra $50 if someone could beat the world record, and Barbados did exactly that, earning himself $100 in total. But in terms of tower optimization, like I already said, there wasn't much room to improve, if any at all. So instead, he actually created a percussion-based sound cue that goes off every time he needed to start the next round, giving Barbados a really huge advantage in terms of timing each round start manually. And of course, this is what became so controversial. And as I said, Barbados himself called this strategy cringe, and that he understands the implications that this has for anyone in the future trying to break the world record. But honestly, I'm not sure that a sub 5-minute time would have ever happened otherwise. Does This Username himself did say in his run that he thought it was possible, albeit very hard, but as I said, the previous world record that he set sat over 3 seconds above that mark for a total time of 6 years and 8 months. And with that being said, second place on the leaderboard, which is now a time of 501.400 by GoldGal64, also uses Barbados' system of sound cues, and it was even performed on mobile, meaning that she didn't have access to the spacebar as a way to start rounds, and instead had to click on the button. So yeah, needless to say, it's incredibly powerful having an audio cue that can tell you when to begin each round, and that really does take the last element of difficulty from the run. So I definitely understand the controversy, but what do you think? And if you enjoyed this video, you'd probably also be interested in the history of BTD5's highest round ever that's been achieved as well.